Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm a minerals processing engineer, also known as a metallurgist. I started my career in Australia working in copper, lead, zinc, silver mines in the 1990s. And after working in the mining industry for a number of years, I went to North America. I did my MBA, focused on sustainability, got into engineering consultancy, and now I have an independent consultancy focused on sustainability in mining called Resourceful Paths. And I'm talking to you from Vancouver. So firstly, what are tailings? Tailings are the fine material that's left over after the extraction of, I'm just move this, sorry, after the extraction of valuable minerals and metals from ores in minerals processing or leaching. And often this is from a grinding process. We have a mixture of solids that are of a sand or silt texture and water. And so some example of processes here, we've got a flotation process that extracts the metals into a froth, and the tailings is what's left behind from these large tanks. We have a leaching process. This is a gold operation in Africa, leaching tanks, and the tailings go into this facility in the background. Here you've got tailings, for example, going out in pipes to the facility. And some of these impoundments can be very large, up to or over 1 billion tons of solids. So just as an example of quantities, here's an approximate example from copper. I've taken a significant copper mine in the United States, Bingham Canyon. That mine treats about 40 million tons per year of ore. And because the copper content's only a fraction of 1%, almost all of that ore ends up in this residual tailings stream. So we're producing from this mine 39 million tons of tailings. If you look at the world, all the copper from mined resources, most of that is processed through what we call concentrators to produce a concentrate for smelting. That's from sulfide ores. And out of that, again, most of the copper has less than 1% of copper in it. So almost all of the 2.7 or so billion tons of ore treated ends up in tailings. And if we look at future projections with increased copper supply, with decreasing ore grades, that's expected to increase. So it's a lot. And we've also got copper. Besides copper, we've got things like gold, iron ore tailings, lead, zinc, nickel, alumina, phosphate, many more. So a lot of material. It's a big issue. So this is a quote from Stephen Vick, who's an expert in tailings from a book in 1990. Fundamental to an understanding of the nature of tailings is a basic knowledge of how they are produced. So if we talk about the nature of tailings, we're generally talking about tailings particle size distribution, the water content, both the amount of water and also the chemistry of the water, and the mineral and chemical content of the particles. And these are affected firstly by geology. So what minerals and textures are present in the original ores. That affects the process flow sheet and affects all of these things. How we dewater and deposit the tailings, the water chemistry, and the interaction with surrounding materials. So we need to think about the whole system and what that means in terms of the materials and their risks. So there's been some high profile failures, especially two in Brazil, of iron ore facilities in Minas Gerais. So in 2015, the Samarco Fundão failure killed 19 people. It destroyed a town. It polluted more than 600 kilometers of the Rio Doce. Here's some photos of the town and also tailings getting into the Atlantic Ocean. So devastating incident. And then in 2019, the Brumadinho facility failed. Here's the dam after failure. It wiped out a mine cafeteria and killed a whole bunch of workers. 270 people died and infrastructure destroyed. So really devastating effects. But these are by no means the only events. There have been events over many years, various places, various commodities. Here's a few. So the Stava incident in Italy is a fluorite mine which destroyed a town and killed hundreds of people. We have Merrispruita gold mine in South Africa, which failed after rainfall and basically sent tailings into a local town and killed people. We have the Los Frailes lead zinc silver mine in Spain in 1998, which failed and devastated surrounding environmental national park. The Ajkai alumina facility in Hungary in 2010, where that failed and ran into a town and killed people. And then in Mount Polley here in British Columbia, a copper gold mine that failed and sent massive amounts of tailings into a local lake and deeply affected an Indigenous community there. So in response to these various failures, and in particular the Brumadinho failure in 2019, there was a push by investors to get more disclosure from industry and also get a defined standard on tailings. And this was basically co-convened by three groups: the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, and the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM. And those groups got together through 2019 and 2020, developed the standard with an independent review panel, and it was launched in August 2020. And the ICMM members, these major mining companies, they have committed to implement the standard for extreme and high risk facilities by 2023, and all other tailings facilities by 2025. It includes 6 elements. So it looks at affected communities, developing an integrated knowledge base, the design, construction, operation, and monitoring of tailings facilities, management and governance, emergency response and long-term recovery, and public disclosure and access to information. And you can read more about the standard at this site. So that's been an important development. I'm going to talk a little bit about strategies for safer tailings management. So a lot of the focus is on safer embankments. And in industry, we talk about 3 broad types of tailings dams. We have upstream, centerline, or downstream, which relates to the types of materials and what supports the dam. So in centerline and downstream construction, you have a weight of stable materials in the embankment that holds back these tailings. This is an example, though, of upstream, where you've got the wall of the embankment going back and being essentially interacting with the finer tailings. And when a tailings failure occurs, all this embankment just collapses, as we saw in Brazil, for example. And these upstream dams are really unsuitable in seismically active regions such as Chile, and also in wet climates such as Brazil. They can be built safely in drier and stable regions such as Australia, but they're highly susceptible to the construction being consistent with the design intent and quality and so forth. So upstream is definitely a riskier type of construction. Limiting the water in the impoundments is also really important, because water often is what gives that tailings the ability to become fluid and to be released in devastating ways. So we talk about dewatering here. What happens in industry is we often use what we call sedimentation, or settling the tailings in thickeners such as these. We can have more robust, more sturdy thickeners like paste thickeners. We can generate stuff that's more like a kind of a sour cream or toothpaste type of consistency, or we can go all the way to filtration and produce stackable tailings, a term that's called dry stacking, but I note it's not that dry. It's a cake that has some moisture in it. The costs of dewatering increase as we go to higher percent solids, but there are rehabilitation benefits and certainly lower risks. Now, what we can also do is look at ways to reduce the quantity of tailings in surface storage. So we can do this through pre-concentration, which is separating out lower grade particles from an ore stream before the grinding, so before the tailings are actually produced. We can also use tailings in beneficial ways, such as putting it back underground as backfill in certain mines, in underground mines, using some tailings materials for construction, or agricultural ameliorants. And this is an example of the Morro Agudo mine in Brazil, where the tailings are actually dewatered and recovered and sent to local farms because the carbonate content is beneficial for them. It's important to understand the characteristics of the tailings to make sure that they can meet these needs, but it is possible in some circumstances. And major mining companies such as BHP have put out challenges and prizes to investigate things like repurposing of copper tailings, and there's a number of teams that are working on this initiative around the world. So I think there's some hope in these areas, but it can be economically challenging. I've got a concept here of how a mine might significantly be able to reduce its impact from tailings. This is an example. If we focus on underground mining, often there's possibilities of placing tailings back underground, including things like pre-concentration, and then with the processing, segregating out the most chemically reactive portions of tailings, such as the sulfides, and putting them, for example, back underground in a paste backfill. And that limits the amount of surface tailings disposal. We can look at dewatering, such as using thickeners or paste thickeners or filtration, and then recovering the water and recycling it. And that reduces the impact both in terms of water consumption and reduces the footprint. So often underground mining is a great way. If you can't do underground mining though, there are still ways that we can do processing in ways to reduce the risks of tailings facilities. I just want to talk briefly also about the GMPA, the Global Mineral Professionals Alliance. It's a global collaboration between peak member associations for minerals professionals. And we have an initiative called the Global Action on Tailings. We're currently leading that initiative with a number of colleagues from around the world. Our members of the member associations, we have ethical obligations to protect the safety and health of the public and the environment. And we're not an industry body. Some of our members, most of our members work with industry, but we do have relevant technical expertise and some degree of independence. And we're hoping to, through things like content sharing, building trust with external groups and addressing the skill shortage in tailings professionals to help move towards more improved tailings management and reducing the risks associated with tailings. So on this note, just happy to take any questions, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laurie. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a fantastic presentation just now by Laurie. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, sir. So on this, I mean, this is something where, and as you showed, there have been some absolutely horrific disasters when it comes to those catastrophic failure of tailings dams. And it's not like Brumadinho was the first one or San Marco was the first one, exactly as you showed. So it's taken us a long while to almost learn our lesson and have initiatives such as the Global Tailings Review, etc., come through. Do you think that we are now on that tipping point of really making a difference, or do you think there's more oomph that's needed for us to actually do what's needed in terms of tailings?
Personally, I think there's more oomph needed. I think, there's been some huge steps, and I think ICMM, through its commitment to the standard and through the development of supporting good practice guides, conformance documents, and so forth, I think the larger mining companies now are in a pretty good place. But a tailings failure anywhere in the mining industry really taints the entire industry. And I think there's a lot of smaller mining companies that they don't have the skills or the resources to do some things properly. I think the awareness of tailings risks and the need to manage them, that's understood, but there's a lot of legacy facilities that still are at risk. We've got climate change and increasing climate variability that makes the risk of failures due to, for example, storm events, floods and so forth, still present. I think there's still a lot more work to do. We're really probably most concerned about the skill shortage because with these events, with challenges with insurance, you've got consultants who I guess have had their reputations damaged because they've somehow either wittingly or unwittingly be involved in failures. That's very damaging for them professionally. There's still a lot of challenges, and we've got to lift the bar in terms of the broader understanding of tailings and tailings risks and how to really get, I think, through the supply chain, the pressure for all the mining industry to responsibly manage tailings, more public disclosure and transparency, and to basically allow the companies to spend the money they need to do things right.
So that's a really good point that you made there. So allowing those mining companies to spend the money that they need to in order to make this right. So where does that money come from, Laurie?
Look, I think the investment community clearly has a role to play here, because if it rewards companies that have good practice, for example, with cheaper finance, with the expectations of doing things properly, that when studies are done, for example, that the approval for lending money is only given if standards are appropriate, for example. I think regulators clearly have a role to play here to make sure that the regulatory regimes all around the world are to a sufficient standard and appropriate for the context. I think those things all help. But it's really up to industry to be moving in the right direction and not trying to kind of make excuses on why they can't afford to manage tailings risks properly. Otherwise, the industry is really in trouble, and it won't be trusted.
Thanks for that, Laurie. And I think so. I mean, I think that really goes to the point of what we're hearing throughout this conference is actually it needs everybody to be pulling together. It can't just be this is what the tailings dam specialists really need and doing that in isolation. It needs everything else to come to that as well. Now, there are a number of questions, some brilliant questions coming in on the Q&A. So maybe you can take a look at them after we finish just now. But there's one that comes in from John Clark, and he says, and I think you know that this one's coming at you. So with the global tailings dam review, there was no real comment on upstream methods as being very high risk. Or that seemed to, or the oomph behind that seemed to be missing. Do you have any comments on that?
Look, there's a really good book written by Deanna Kemp and Andrew Hopkins that talks about the Tailings Standard, how it was put together, the interaction between the co-conveners, the influence of industry, and in particular ICMM. I recommend that people read that book. I might just put a link of that into the chat, Sarah. On upstream dams, there's very strong resistance from industry to ban upstream dams universally. And industry really opposes command and control type of directives about practices. But the reality is in some parts of the world, like especially places like Chile, Peru, Brazil, etc., it is extremely difficult, almost impossible to build upstream dams safely because you can't trust that the operators over time will do things right, or there might be knowledge gaps. People may not sort of appreciate the risks or dealing with extreme events well enough. In places like Australia, it's still very commonly practiced, and I think the industry is really strongly opposed to just a universal ban. But I think what mining companies need to do is they need to scrutinise that method much more strongly and only really use it when it's absolutely safe to do. And there's some tailings that have properties that drain very easily, for example, or it can be done safely. But it's just not worth taking the risk. And if industry pushes too hard to continue to be able to use certain practices that end up causing problems, then they may be forced to not practice things in certain ways. It's like, for example, cyanide. Cyanide is being managed by the gold industry now. Had it not managed things through the International Cyanide Code, for example, maybe cyanide would be banned in even more parts of the world, for example. So upstream, it is controversial. In many parts of the world, it's appropriate to ban. Industry will resist. We got to hold them to account, but it can be done safely in some places.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Laurie. And please do post that link into the chat. Just a health warning on it, though. It is an absolute nightmare to try and download the book, but keep pestering the publisher.
Yes.
And eventually,
I agree.
Eventually, they will give you a link that will hopefully work for you. So do pester the publisher, or at least maybe we should all motivate for all of us to be able to see that book via another method, because it's well worth the read. But brilliant. Thank you very much, Laurie. A massive round of applause, and thank you for that insight to tailings dams. Brilliant.
Thank you, Sarah.
Fantastic. Great.